In my last video, we dove into the iconic powers of Phoenix, Garuda, and Ramu. These introductory icons serve as a great starting point for understanding the game's combat system, but the latter half of the game introduces some of the more complex iconic powers. Today's video will discuss Titanic Block, Wings of Light, and Cold Snap. We'll break down their use case in combat along with the unique combat abilities from their respective icons, and by the end of this video, you'll be able to master any of these three icons. The final icon, Odin, will be discussed in one last video for this series, as I wanted a bit more time to properly research his abilities. But for now, my name is Atano, and this is part 2 of mastering every iconic power in Final Fantasy XVI. We're kicking things off with Titan, who has some of the most feel-good abilities in the game with impeccable sound design. His abilities may be slower because of their charge-up windows, but they still manage to hit hard with their extremely high damage power and large hitboxes. His iconic feat Titanic Block is such a satisfying move to perform, and it's capable of countering every attack in the game, making it an easy pick for many players who prefer a more defensive approach to combat. When activated, Clive will summon Titan's Fist to block an incoming attack. It protects against both enemy melee and enemy projectile attacks. Plus, if activated just before the attack hits Clive, a precise block will occur, dealing a small amount of damage. Clive can follow this up with 3 counter-strikes, with the third and final strike knocking back smaller enemies. Clive is not invincible during these counter-strikes, but luckily enough, the strikes can be cancelled at any time with another Titanic Block or even an evade. Rook's Gambit can also be activated during the counter-strikes for an awesome precision attack that deals solid willpower. Keep this in mind when blocking multi-hit attacks from larger enemies, as these types of enemies won't get staggered and they'll continue attacking you even after Clive's precision block. Furthermore, every enemy attack that I was able to test in the Hall of Virtue can be precision blocked, even those with these red display names. There is one exception, however, and that's Poison Mist from the Reaper. It can't be blocked or countered, so consider evading this attack instead. You may come across attacks that will also shatter Titan's Fists if you don't precisely block them, sending Clive into a brief stun period where he can't move, attack, or evade. Now, which attacks cause the fist to shatter seems to be all over the place, since unfortunately we don't have any actual indicator other than trial and error. The main takeaway is to always aim for the precision block, but if your block happens to shatter, you can very quickly activate Limit Break to cancel Clive's stun period. And lastly, before we move on, Titanic Block can be used to cancel any of Clive's basic attacks, and more notably longer abilities like Garuda's Gouge. In my last video, I mentioned the Gouge and Rook's Gambit combo, but instead you can activate Titanic Block anytime after the first 2 slashes of Gouge to cancel it and counter any attack coming Clive's way. Now onto Titan's iconic abilities. Each of his abilities deals some of the highest damage power in the game, but are a tad weaker at outputting willpower for depleting an enemy's will bar. Furthermore, half of these abilities have brief charge-up periods that require precise executions to reach their highest damage potential. First is Wind Up, which sees Clive perform a devastating punch attack that can knock back smaller enemies quite a long ways, while also dealing numerous hits if precisely executed. When just pressing the Wind Up attack input, Clive will only perform a single low damage punch, so it's always best to hold the attack input to initiate the charge up. Once the bar is within the red zone, release your attack input to execute the strongest version of Wind Up. The 2 gold zones on either end of the red zone will also act as precise execution windows, but unfortunately don't increase Wind Up's damage and hit numbers as significantly as they do in the red zone. Red zone executions see a 15% damage increase over their gold zone counterparts. Wind Up's charge period can be cancelled with an evade or Titanic Block if you notice an incoming attack. Plus, Wind Up's attack animation serves as a great buffer period for charge magic to launch smaller enemies into the air for Phoenix shifting and aerial combos. Next is Upheaval, and it functions very identical to Wind Up. Clive slams Titan's Fist into the ground, creating a 360 degrees earthquake, downing smaller enemies. You can buffer Burning Blade for a quick follow-up attack, or even execute a Wind Up just as the enemy lands on the ground to deal some serious damage. Like Wind Up, red zone executions will receive a damage increase, but only by 12% instead of 15%. Upheaval is overall a weaker ability for raw damage when compared to Wind Up, but it has the benefit of being accessible when airborne. If executed while airborne, the charge-up window will be dismissed entirely, plus Upheaval's damage output will change relative to Clive's height when executed. There's exactly 3 damage values identical to the values of a grounded upheaval, and the easiest way to achieve the highest damage is by using Garuda's Wicked Wheel to gain height before slamming down. Its damage does max out at the peak of Wicked Wheel, so if you happen to be any higher, don't expect upheaval's damage to increase further. Raging Fist is my personal favorite of Titan's abilities. It's a multi-hit attack that sees Clive summons Titan's Fist and release a flurry of punches with extreme swiftness. The number of punches can be extended by continuously pressing its input button, plus the attack animation can be cancelled at any time with an Evade, Rook's Gambit, or Titanic block. The best feature of Raging Fist is its built-in counter mechanic. If the ability is activated just before an enemy attack connects, Clive will counter the attack with each subsequent strike, seeing a damage buff along with increased hits. All enemies will become frozen in place during the counterattacks, so Clive will not be at any risk for receiving damage. You compare this with Ramuh's Lightning Rod and Ifrit's Will of the Wikes to deal some serious damage along with melting any enemy's will bar. Taking advantage of the counter mechanic will also reduce Raging Fist's cooldown by 50% to a total of 16 seconds. However, the cooldown actually begins during the attack animation itself, so realistically it's actually an 11-second cooldown. I bring this up because theoretically you can use Raging Fist as a replacement for Titanic block. It can counter all the same attacks, be cancelled by an evade, freeze surrounding enemies, and deal more damage. The downside is that the ability has a cooldown, activation doesn't cancel any of Clive's attacks, and if the counter window is missed, Clive will take damage instead of just blocking the attack. I'd say if you like the counter mechanic of Titanic block, definitely give Raging Fist a try as an alternative. That way you can free up an iconic feat slot to try different playstyles. Lastly is Titan's signature ability Earth and Fury, which sends a rolling earthquake towards enemies. It should really only be used against smaller enemies since they'll be knocked back along with the earthquake and suffer multiple hits. The earthquake passes straight through larger enemies without even dealing much damage, so you're better off opting out for a different signature ability like Ramuh's Judgment Bolt against these larger enemies. Moving on now to Bahamut's Wings of Light. Definitely one of the more unique feats in the game that requires good evasion skills and a little bit of patience. Wings of Light works really well with a few of the game's support abilities, especially if you enjoy keeping your distance from enemies and something very similar to a mage build. When activated, Clive summons the Wings of Bahamut to hover and charge up Mega Flare. When activated, Clive cannot perform any melee attacks, magic attacks, or iconic abilities. There are some workarounds to this however, but more on that in a minute. Mega Flare can be charged to a maximum of level 4, and when idle, each level takes exactly 5 seconds to charge. However, if Clive moves around during the charging of Mega Flare, the time it takes for the level bar to fill will be doubled, meaning it will now take 10 seconds to charge each level. So avoid moving around at all costs if you can. When Mega Flare reaches at least level 1, you can re-trigger Wings of Light to rain down a shower of light beams, damaging surrounding enemies within a fairly generous radius. But if an enemy is out of range of Mega Flare's area of effect, Clive can move closer to that enemy, and Mega Flare will also move accordingly. Each subsequent Mega Flare level will increase the ability's duration along with the number of light beams that rain down. But interestingly enough, the individual damage of each light beam will actually reduce once you reach level 3 and level 4. The combined damage of every light beam is still higher than the previous levels given the ability's increased duration, but I find it odd that the individual light beams become nerfed. Clive can also dodge while charging Mega Flare to avoid any enemy attacks, but keep in mind that dodges will also significantly reduce the speed at which Mega Flare charges. Luckily enough though, a precision dodge will instantly increase Mega Flare's level by 1, and this is where good evasion skills come into play. Getting good at predicting enemy attacks will increase the overall effectiveness of Wings of Light, since you'll be able to quickly activate the feat just before an enemy attacks to precisely dodge out of the way and increase Mega Flare's level. If Clive happens to get hit while charging up Mega Flare, Wings of Light will deactivate and the level bar will slowly reduce back to 0 unless you quickly reactivate the ability. Lastly, before we move on, let's discuss some of the attacks Clive can perform while waiting for Mega Flare to charge. The first ability is Satellite, which allows Clive to fire low damage light projectiles by pressing the magic input while simultaneously charging Mega Flare. It can keep a single smaller enemy at bay, but also having Ifrit's Will of the Wikes activated will defend you against potential incoming attacks from other enemies. Plus, if Clive gets hit, Wings of Light won't be deactivated. Ramuh's Lightning Rod is going to deliver the most support damage and can be used alongside the previous 2 abilities or all on its own. If used in tandem with Will of the Wikes, Clive can stand directly next to the rod for constant lightning blasts that keep all surrounding enemies enemies at bay, making it one of the safest options for charging up Mega Flare against a group of smaller enemies. If you've been enjoying the video so far and finding it informative, consider subscribing down below as it really helps out my growing channel. Next is Bahamut's iconic abilities, which are all magic-based range attacks that lend themselves to a mage-style build. On their own, they aren't necessarily the strongest abilities for dealing raw damage, but instead serve the purpose of supporting other abilities, especially when trying to deplete a will bar or increase the multiplier on staggered enemies. Impulse sends out 4 spheres that pursue a target before binding to it and dealing continuous damage. During the binding state, Clive is free to use other attacks, evade, or switch to other enemies. Re-executing Impulse once the spheres have been bound to an enemy will trigger an explosion, dealing additional damage. Explosion damage is determined by how long the spheres have been bound to their targets. There are 3 different damage levels, and you'll know the explosion strength is at its peak when the spheres glow orange. If you wait too long to trigger the explosion, however, the spheres will simply dissipate and you'll miss out on the bonus damage. Furthermore, Clive can trigger the explosion at any given time, even if he is in the animation of another ability. Impulse has really solid willpower all on its own, but combining it with something like Garuda's Gouge is going to be even better for very quickly melting an enemy's will bar. Next is Flare Breath, which is a multi-hit ability that sees Clive emit a sustained stream of blue fire that deals continuous damage against enemies for a total of 12 seconds. The analog sticks can be used to move and aim the fire once activated, and it can be cancelled at any time with an Evade, Titanic Block, or Rook's Gambit. On its own, Flare Breath is just decent at best, but using it alongside Ramuh's Lightning Rod, Bahamut's Satellite, or even Shiva's Rhyme can help stack on additional damage and increase will bar depletion against larger enemies. Satellite summons 2 orbiting spheres around Clive that dispel assisting light projectiles when inputting any magic attack. This includes charged magic, magic burst, and precision shot. Satellite is especially great with charged magic since it will launch enemies up into the air for starting air combos with only a single charge, unlike before where a single charged shot will simply knock enemies down. It's also really great for back-to-back lunge bursts since the Satellite's projectiles will keep smaller enemies at bay directly in front of Clive. But regardless of which attack you use, the Satellites will stay active for 30 seconds, which is a generous amount of time. It's such a great support ability for magic attacks and other iconic abilities since Clive can fire the Satellites at any time he pleases. This feature works especially well during Wings of Light and even Ramuh's Blind Justice. Finally, we have Giga Flare, which is Bahamut's signature ability that fires a massive beam of overcharged light in a straight line. And like other signature abilities in the game, it's often best used against staggered enemies with an active 1.5 damage multiplier. Combining it with Ramuh's Lightning Rod, Shiva's Rhyme, Will o' the Wisps, and a pair of Satellites will help rack up some pretty solid staggered damage. Bahamut's abilities may steer in a different direction from the heavy-hitting melee-focused attacks of Titan, but they don't go without their perks and capabilities. If you're looking for a mage build in Final Fantasy XVI, Bahamut is the place to start. Then adding to your loadout some of Ramuh's abilities like Lightning Rod, Thunderstorm, and even Blind Justice will allow you to expand your mage capabilities even further. Last and certainly not least is Shiva's Cold Snap. I'll be honest, I didn't find myself using this feat too often during my initial playthrough of the game, but after spending a little bit of time with it in the Hall of Virtue, I'm starting to see why it's loved by so many players. When activated on the ground or the air, Clive will swiftly slide in any direction to dodge enemy attacks. It can also be used to mitigate gaps between Clive and enemies, or even create gaps to allow space for executing some of the game's ranged abilities. Re-triggering Cold Snap before the slide is finished will execute Frostbite, where Clive places an ice shard that briefly freezes any enemy that comes into contact with it. Keep in mind that if freezing an attacking enemy, Frostbite won't cancel that enemy's attack. Their animation will only be frozen briefly before they return to finish the attack they started. Along with freezing enemies, Frostbite will also freeze the recovery of an enemy's stagger bar. But this isn't a tactic I'd recommend using right away, since by the time Clive recovers from Frostbite's animation to once again start attacking, the enemy will already be thawed out and their stagger bar recovering. However, once you unlock Odin's Rift Slip, this tactic becomes a bit more viable at prolonging an enemy's recovery, but more on that in a future video. Cold Snap can be used identically to an Evade for cancelling any of Clive's basic melee attacks, Titan's Raging Fists, and even Garuda's Gouge. Plus, if timed precisely, Clive will trigger Permafrost, which freezes all surrounding enemies within a wide radius. Frozen enemies won't be affected damage from the knockdown or launch effect of certain attacks until permafrost has ended. Freeze duration is relative to the strength of the enemy attack dodged, so theoretically the stronger the attack, the longer permafrost will last. But based on what I could test in the Hall of Virtue, permafrost duration rarely changes even when dodging significantly stronger attacks. Using Cold Snap to dodge both a Goblin's basic melee attack and Gigas' sweeping attack only causes permafrost to last for 6 seconds each. There's only a few larger enemy attacks that will increase permafrost duration, but the duration is only slightly increased up to 8 seconds. Furthermore, permafrost can't be triggered when dodging enemy magic attacks. Clive will instead just slide right through them to evade out of the way. Just a second ago, I briefly mentioned Frostbite being able to freeze the recovery of an enemy's stagger bar. Permafrost can also achieve this effect, and it lasts far longer than Frostbite. The only thing you'll need is a nearby enemy to attack you once Clive has fully staggered an enemy. Use Cold Snap to precisely dodge the attack to activate permafrost and momentarily freeze the recovery of the staggered enemy. This tactic adds 6 seconds to an enemy's recovery time, allowing you to get in a bit more damage. Shiva's iconic abilities are a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to their use cases, but I find they often work best for crowd control. With the exception of Diamond Dust, each of her abilities lie on the weaker end of the spectrum in regards to damage and willpower. But to make up for this, they each have noticeably quicker cooldowns when compared to many other iconic abilities. Ice Age uproots a river of icicles in front of Clive, launching smaller enemies into the air. Its final icicle deals the most damage and also freezes the enemy if executed while the marker is in the red zone. Frozen enemies can easily be shifted towards to start aerial combos, or you can quickly follow up with Shiva's Mesmerize to bring the enemy straight back to Clive for more groundwork. Only the final icicle of Ice Age causes the frozen effect, so when using against larger enemies, make sure you have proper spacing to achieve this extra damage and the frozen status. Mesmerize sends out 6 shards around Clive, 3 in front and 3 behind. The ice shards pull smaller enemies towards Clive's position for mitigating gaps during combat. If used while airborne, Mesmerize will instead pull them directly underneath Clive's position for him to easily land a down thrust. This ability is far less effective against larger enemies since they can't be pulled in by the ice shards, but regardless, it's a solid ability for crowd control on smaller enemies and an awesome starter for chaining together iconic abilities. Clive can follow it up with Garuda's Wicked Wheel, then Titan's Upheaval, before finishing it off with Ramuh's Pile Drive. Next is Rhyme, and it's a support ability similar to Ramuh's Lightning Rod. When executed, Clive fires an ice shard which transforms into a large spinning ice crystal that deals 15 seconds of continuous damage to enemies trapped inside of it. If executed on an idle enemy directly in front of Clive, the ice shard will simply pass right through them. But if the enemy is damaged and then Rhyme is executed, the ice shard will push the enemy back into the spinning crystal. The ability can also be re-triggered at any time for repositioning the ice crystal during combat to trap additional enemies. Rhyme's damage power may be a tad weak, but you can trap quite a lot of enemies within its crystal, making it one of the best crowd control abilities in the game. And combined with other ranged abilities in the game like Ramuh's Blind Justice, Lightning Rod, and Bahamut's Impulse, you can deal some really easy magic damage very quickly. And finally, we have Shiva's signature ability, Diamond Dust. Diamond Dust freezes all nearby enemies before unleashing a powerful ice blast in all directions. It deals some of the highest will damage in the entire game for depleting an enemy's will bar, but more importantly, if used on fully staggered enemies, it will freeze their recovery before immediately increasing their damage multiplier to 1.5. It's an essential ability for starting the strongest stagger combos, and following it up with other signature iconic abilities will guarantee as much stagger damage possible with that active 1.5 multiplier. From Titan's incredible damage power and defensive prowess to Shiva's swiftness and distinct crowd control capabilities, Final Fantasy XVI's combat system truly becomes astonishing towards the latter half of the game. If you made it here to the end, thank you so much, and I hope you found this video to be insightful and informative. The final video for this series will dive into the iconic power of Odin, so if that's something you'd be interested in watching, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on that upload. And lastly, as always, thanks for tuning in today. I'll see you all in the next one.